All right. We'll give people a couple seconds as they log on. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the Clark Fork Coalition today for this virtual field trip to Boulder Creek Watershed in Granite County, Montana. So I am Lily Haynes. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Clark Fork Coalition here in Missoula, and I'm going to be hosting the field trip today. The Clark Fork Coalition is a conservation organization focused on the restoration and protection of the Clark Fork watershed. We're based here in Missoula, and today our goal is to give you all an opportunity to learn about the Boulder Creek watershed, an incredibly important part of the Upper Clark Fork system. Boulder Creek is 70 square mile tributary watershed to the Flint Creek, and because of its cold water and also its important bull trout fishery, it is a really important asset to the restoration and the resources of the Upper Clark Fork. So to start our trip, we are going to kind of visit two of the restoration projects on Boulder Creek in a really beautifully shot video. After that glimpse of the watershed, I'm going to bring on several of our project partners for a panel discussion about the restoration that's going on. You'll hear from these panelists their unique perspective from their different organizations on Boulder Creek and why it's so important. And you'll have the opportunity to use your Q&A or your hand raise or your chat features to interact with these panelists, ask them questions, maybe advice if you're working on projects of your own. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And to bring us all into this virtual space, I'm going to ask everybody who's attending if you wouldn't mind opening up your chat feature and then introducing yourself there. So if you can tell us who you are, give us your name, where you're from, whether that be your geographical location or the organization that you're with. We'd love to see who we're working with today. If you're just joining us, again, welcome to this virtual field trip. My name is Lily Haynes and I'm going to be your host. In just a second, we're going to get started visiting the Boulder Creek watershed with a really beautiful video. And right now, everybody is popping into the chat to introduce themselves, to bring us all into that virtual space together. If you're unfamiliar with using the chat in Zoom, beneath the video that you're seeing right now, there are several icons. One of them is a chat icon, and if you click on it, it'll bring up kind of a text box on the side of your screen. Awesome. I see several of our agency people entering in there. Hi, hi to Helena people. And while you guys are introducing yourselves, I'm going to actually ask one of our panelists to come up on screen. This is one of my colleagues and a good friend, Will McDowell. Will, you can turn on your video for us. Awesome, good to see you. So Will McDowell is the Restoration Director at the Clark Fork Coalition. He provides, technical assistance and expertise on irrigation and stream restoration projects. His background is in biology and watershed hydrology. And I'm going to have Will kind of introduce Boulder Creek to you and introduce the projects that we're going to see in this video here. Will, there are still lots of people logging on, telling us who they are and introducing themselves. So it's great to see you all attendees. Thank you so much for joining us today. In just a second, we'll get started with the video. And then we'll have our project partners up here to answer questions and talk about the two projects that you see in the video. Right now, Will, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit more background on the Boulder Creek watershed.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lily. As Lily said, my name is Will McDowell. I work with the Clark Fork Coalition. On these projects in Granite County, in the Boulder Creek watershed, I actually have been working in the capacity of technical project manager for a partner organization to the Clark Fork Coalition. The partner organization that's key here is called the Watershed Restoration Coalition. They've been around for over 20 years, based in Deer Lodge. It's a watershed group, a nonprofit watershed group that was formed by landowners, primarily by people in the ranching community, to promote conservation and restoration work in the Upper Clark Fork. So the WRC is featured in the video because they are really the key nonprofit organization, along with the partners that you'll be hearing from later at the Natural Resource Damage Program, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and others. But I'm going to share my screen first off to show you a little bit about where we're talking about. Where is this Boulder Creek? It's not a very large watershed, but as Lily said, it is an important one. So I'm going to share a map that depicts where this watershed is. And let's see if that's visible to people. Can blow it up just a little bit. Whoops, maybe too much. All right. Okay, so if I share my screen up a little bit further, you can see Flint Creek watershed in the upper corner there is a major watershed flowing into the Clark Fork River at Drummond. And it's almost entirely within Granite County. And so Flint Creek flows alongside Highway 1, where it goes from Drummond through Hall up to Phillipsburg. That's Flint Creek. And Boulder Creek flows in, as you can see on this map now, where the arrow's pointing, is the Boulder Creek watershed. That's a major tributary to Flint Creek coming in from the east. It comes in off the peaks of the Flint Creek Range from very high elevation, 10,000 foot headwaters. And it flows, as you can see on this map, which shows land ownership, it flows primarily through Forest Service property. Everything you see on that map that's green is U.S. Forest Service. And so Boulder Creek is mostly a heavily timbered watershed, very steep and very cold, steep streams. The tributaries that flow into Boulder Creek are all steep, and they luckily still are all in pretty good condition water quality wise. Even though, interestingly, in history, if you want to dig into it, the Boulder Creek watershed was a major mining district in the past, which many people in Granite County know all about. But many of those mines have been reclaimed by the Forest Service, and so the water quality is now in very good condition in Boulder Creek. So very briefly, in 2015, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Natural Resource Damage Program, as state agencies, got together with Clark Fork Coalition, the Watershed Restoration Coalition, and Trout Unlimited to outline where they wanted to invest restoration dollars in the Flint Creek Basin. And Boulder Creek was the primary area for investment. So we went to the field and started identifying potential projects. And the projects that we're going to outline today are both actually on private land. So inside this watershed that's primarily Forest Service owned, there are private inholdings, especially along the drainages. And those are often old mining claims. And this is where we're doing these projects that we're going to highlight today. So I think the video will speak for itself a little bit, and then we'll come back in and explain the projects after the video in a little bit more detail. But those are some of the background pieces that I wanted to lay out at first.
Awesome, Will. You can go ahead and mute yourself, close your video down. For those of you who are attending, we close our videos down because the Zoom format can be a little bit choppy. So you'll see me disappear, and we'll bring that video up on screen for you to watch for about 5 minutes.
place. It's a tributary to Flint Creek that comes out of the high country in the Flint Creek range with cold, clean water, and it is a real stronghold for native fish, especially cutthroat trout and bull trout. One of the 4 places in the whole upper Clark Fork above the Blackfoot that even has bull trout still surviving. And that's one of the reasons the fish biologists told us when we first started working in the Flint Creek drainage that Boulder Creek is a key priority. And that's why we went there, and that's where we found excellent projects with good landowners where we could work with people who really care about this drainage.
My name is Jeremy Mickey. I'm a project manager and field superintendent for a local construction company out of Granite County. My family homesteaded in the town called Princeton, which is about 2 miles upstream from here on Boulder Creek. So I have a vested interest on Boulder Creek from both a historical perspective with my family and as well as a current perspective. And I'm a really avid fisherman who tries to do as much as I can to see the effects of some of these projects and some of the things that have been done on Boulder Creek in the past with just kind of not really scientific methods, but with the fly rod.
Boulder Creek flowed down its old channel, 2011 massive flooding event up here on Boulder Creek. It took off across the meadow that I'm looking down, intercepted a pond, blew out a dam, and created an upstream fisheries migration barrier, but also a place where large trout could then hang out in a pond that would then be picked off by birds. So there were a lot of impacts to the local fishery that needed to be addressed. And so through that project identification process, NRDP, working with our other partners, got an engineering firm on board and awarded to a local construction company here in Granite County. There's about $20 million allocated to the tributaries for direct fisheries restoration work like we've done here on Boulder Creek. And so we had these priority projects in Boulder Creek that all tie to getting fish out and down to Flint Creek and ultimately the Clark Fork River, and then allowing those fish that out-migrate to Boulder Creek, Flint Creek, and then ultimately the upper Clark Fork River Basin.
Watershed Restoration Coalition, Clark Fork Coalition with the NRDP had great partnerships, but the key in Boulder Creek watershed, the key to success are the landowners. The landowners that we work with there, really dedicated to conservation, really in love with the land that they manage in that drainage, and that makes all the difference.
Many years we had concerns because during flooding season it was taking out good dirt and pasture with the high water and making new stream through some of the areas which would take away from the pasture. Then we met Will and the groups he is working with currently, and he told us that and what they were trying to accomplish, and we felt like they were very viable and wonderful project. We didn't have any second thoughts either. One of the things that I found super interesting was the way the willows were planted. Well, the very next year they started sprouting, and it was just amazing to me to see it, and then to have the trees and the willows that were planted around the edges start growing rather quickly. We were pleased to see that happen as well.
I'm Ole Olson. I am a 5th generation native Montana. We had a flood in 2011, a pretty serious flood. It actually washed out above, right on the edge of our property, and came right through this valley bottom here and washed out everything, the trees, the fences, until it actually plugged the whole creek and sent it over here. So they had to dig out a ton of rock to put that channel back into its original position. And when I first saw what they did with the creek, I was just shocked. It looked so good. That, and obviously it's gonna grow fish. You know, the whole idea was to help the Clark Fork restore the fishery. Well, I think this did.
All right, so I'm going to ask our panelists, Will, Brad, Bo, and Jeremy, if you guys can turn on your cameras there. Come back on with us. Welcome, welcome. Hi, Jeremy, you're on now. So awesome, some great visuals of the watershed there. And for all our attendees, what we're going to do now is just introduce our panelists to you. And give them the opportunity to talk about Boulder Creek and the restoration there from the unique perspective of their organizations. And Will, I think that maybe we'll start with you and the Clark Fork Coalition and any other background you want to give on the project. Then we'll turn it over to Brad and Bo, and I'll have you guys go next. Sound good?
Sure. Okay, you want me to take off? I'll explain a little bit more about the projects and what they actually were intended to accomplish with a couple of diagrams, if that's okay, if I can share my screen.
Go for it.
I think people will be able to see what we were trying to do out there on the ground. That was the map, and I need to shrink this down a little bit. Here we go. So this, I'm going to talk first about the Olson Project, and this is the site. This is an aerial photo. So what Oli was talking about and what Bo mentioned in the 2011 flood is depicted here. Can you see my arrow on the screen moving?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Boulder Creek flowing from upstream to downstream. In pre-2011, the stream was over here in this orange channel, far away from the houses that are the house that's located here, the Olson house. And so the stream flowed against this side of the valley and down. What happened in 2011 is the flood was so massive and the amount of material, gravel and cobble that was moved by the floodwaters was so large that it plugged its own channel here. And then the stream jumped out of its channel and flowed through this meadow. And as it flowed down this meadow, it encountered this pre-existing pond, which is labeled here. And the whole Boulder Creek, which is quite a large stream, flowed into this tiny earthen dam pond and then blew out a corner of the dam and flowed back to its old channel here. So that was problematic from a number of perspectives, and Brad will explain some of the reasons, but there's an earthen dam here, and that earthen dam had, once the stream flowed into it like that, there was a big drop here, and that blocked fish from being able to move back up through Boulder Creek. And this channel over here, the old channel that had been there for decades or hundreds of years, dried up entirely. So the project intent was to restore the connectivity and fish passage up and down Boulder Creek by taking this section of new channel formed by the flood and this section and removing the stream and putting it back over into the orange channel here. And then there were some other activities that needed to be done that Bo and Jeremy maybe can explain a little bit more. So that's the first project. And then I wanted to show a picture of a bull trout that Jeremy captured when he was working on draining the pond in order to do this restoration. There was a bull trout living in that pond. And then quickly to the other project, this one's slightly downstream on the Lundgren's property. The Lundgrens wasn't mentioned in the film, but the Lundgrens have lived for 3 generations on this property. There's several different family members living there now. but it used to be a dairy farm. And you can see this area that I'm signaling here is a very large meadow that was used originally for dairy farming. And at this point, the Lundgrens are no longer running livestock other than a few horses. But what had happened is that these stream banks along the meadow had started to eat their way into the meadow, as Sherry mentioned in the video. And at this point here, where this sharp bend was, the stream was high water jumping out and flowing across the pasture and threatening to cut off this whole piece of the pasture from access, as were some of the other areas. To give you an example really quick, this is a picture of what the stream bank looked like before remediation and restoration, not remediation, but before restoration work was done. As you can see, the pasture area is just eroding away, falling into the stream. And then when you look at it as a before and after pictures at the same spot, you can see that this bank was eroding further and further into the meadow. The stream was very wide, and as streams like this get wider, they start to lose habitat value, and there's no cover on this side of the stream at all either. So the restoration was restoring this bank and cover and vegetation and habitat quality by building a deeper, allowing this to form its own deeper pool. So those are some of the things that were done in the Lundgren Project at 5 different locations. So those are just some background on what we actually did out there with contractors under NRDP's supervision with oversight from Watershed Restoration Coalition and in some respects too. So that's what I got.
Super cool. Thanks, Will. Those before and afters are really helpful in seeing kind of the work that was done. And so again, we're kind of especially visiting 2 different projects that were done in the Boulder Creek watershed. And as we move into our panelists, into the other partners in this program, I just want to encourage all the attendees to use the chat feature. You can send that. There's an option to speak directly to the panelists or to share conversation with panelists and attendees. You can choose that. Ask questions of Will or of our other panelists. You can use the Q&A feature or hand raise too, and I will be trying to monitor that and feed those questions into these guys so we can learn more and get your needs met. I'm going to introduce now Brad Learman. Brad Learman is a fisheries management biologist for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and he specifically focuses on the lower half of the Upper Clark Fork, which includes the Flint Creek drainage. He's been working there for 13 years, more than that as a fisheries biologist, though, for the state of Montana, right, Brad?
Yes, yes.
Well, thanks for joining us today with all of that knowledge that you have. And I'm wondering, Brad, if you want to start, Brad, and then Bo, we'll move on to you, just talking about the perspective of your agency, why the Boulder Creek restoration fits into that greater objectives of your agency, and kind of what your role in the whole project was.
Yes, no problem. Yeah, you can definitely tell by all the gray hair that I've been around for a few years. So, but yeah, so the Boulder Creek drainage is definitely a very important native fish fishery, and like Will mentioned, we've been talking about Boulder Creek for years, because as soon as I moved up here and got looking at the fishery, I realized how much value it really has. It's both a resident, it maintains both a resident and a migratory bull trout population, and also a resident and migratory westlope cutthroat trout population. To focus on the bull trout, it really is more of a resident population than migratory. See a lot of a lot of resident fish up there that we know are completing their entire life cycle within the drainage, but we do see a few migratory fish that do move down into the main stem into Flint Creek and use those habitats. And definitely westlope cutthroat, we see, again, both those life history types of resident and migratory. One reason it is such a high priority is it is the only bull trout stream in the Flint Creek drainage. So there's a lot of westlope cutthroat trout streams in the Flint Creek drainage, but this is the only bull trout stream. And it's actually one of 3 or 4 in the Upper Clark Fork above Rock Creek. So very important from a native fish standpoint because of that. It also does support a sport fish fishery of brown trout and brook trout too, just so folks know. so that which are non-native fish, but they are in the system. So Bo and I and other folks at NRDP years ago set out to try to prioritize where in the Clark Fork drainage that NRDP money would be most effectively spent to improve our high value fisheries. And when we went through that process, Boulder Creek definitely came out ranking very high against all the other tributaries to the upper Clark Fork. Again, mainly due to its value as a native fish stronghold, but also because it does provide fish recruitment, or basically young fish to the Clark Fork River to help that fishery also. So that's a quick background on the fish itself. I'll get into maybe a little bit about the specific impacts of these projects on the fishery. Some of this might be a little bit redundant because I know Will covered some of this, but I'm kind of looking at it from a fish perspective too. The Lundgren Project was definitely a project I noticed right away when I started working in the Boulder Creek watershed, and then definitely when Will started working there, we identified it very quickly as a viable project. Will was just saying he's looked back at some notes in 2015 when we first started talking about projects, and this was definitely one of the first ones we discussed.
Hey, Fred, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Sure.
For people who aren't as familiar with, the difference between the two projects and myself. So the Lundgren Project is what we're talking about, where you did a lot of that planting, bank rebuilding. Give us like the Lundgren Project was which type of project?
Yeah, the Lundgren Project is the one where we did, where Will and the Clark Fork Coalition did a lot of revegetation and bank stabilization and revegetation. Where the Olson Project is the one where they did they had the new channel that was formed during the flood that was repaired. So the Lundgren Project, let me pull my notes back up here. Sorry, the Lundgren Project. Again, we identified it pretty early as that property is needing some basically lacking habitat complexity, and also it had pretty poor riparian vegetation in the reach. And so, as most tenants probably know, bull trout particularly and West Slope cutthroat need cold water and they need complex habitat to do well. And that was really lacking in that reach due to some of the historic use as a dairy farm and grazing in general. And so that was the objectives of that. The Olson Project was something actually we didn't identify right away because it didn't actually, the channel avulsion, or basically the jumping of the channel into the new channel, didn't happen until 2011. So that was something that kind of came up after we had already done a lot of prioritization, but was quickly identified as an issue because the landowner was having a lot of issues with his pond. I was having to issue 310 permits, which we do as a regulator, our agency does, to try to deal with it. And we realized there was an issue there. And mainly what had happened was the creation of that new channel that captured the pond created a series of head cuts, which is a natural process of channels creating, of rivers creating new channels. But it made fish passage through the reach very difficult, and it also made maintenance of the pond nearly impossible for the landowner. And it's just really not an ideal situation to have a wild stream, a natural stream flowing through an unnatural pond situation. And I won't go into the details of that, but there's a lot of issues with that. And so really the goals that, we were looking at was fish passage was imperative, particularly for the native fish to get through that reach. It's obviously important to all the fisheries, but the native fish tend to migrate more and are obviously the focus of these projects. So it's very important to get fish passage back. But it's interesting because the landowner also had some different objectives, which was to try to stabilize his pond and get his pond back. And I think, as you'll see as we talk more, this project worked out great, and it kind of met all those goals. So yeah, so that's my basic introduction on the fisheries. I was going to just add one more thing, which was that, and I already alluded to this, but it's interesting. Some folks maybe don't see this as much and realize it, but Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has two roles in a lot of these projects. We obviously want to advocate for completing good restoration projects, and we also complete them ourselves sometimes. But we do also serve as regulators on these projects via the Streambed Preservation Act. So we actually do issue permits to complete work on streams, basically anything that affects the stream bed and bank. And so through that, we do have to be regulators at times, which means we're not always the most appreciated part of a restoration team. But it's also a very important part in that we protect a lot of habitat in Montana through doing that, and it's also an interesting balancing act of being both a regulator and working to just try to do quality to basically advocate for good quality restoration work being done on these streams.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brad. We had a couple questions for you that we might as well address now.
Okay.
One of those was the process of studying the fisheries. And you guys, when you're looking at bull trout numbers versus maybe cutthroat or brown trout in that Boulder Creek system, you're using the electroshocking to kind of get that fish count. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the primary thing we use in Boulder Creek is electrofishing. We do actually our main monitoring tool for bull trout throughout my area and kind of their range in the upper Clark Fork is red counts. But interestingly, which is a red is where adult fish spawn, deposit eggs and the interesting thing is in Boulder Creek, these are actually more resident fish, like I said before, than migratory. So they're actually smaller fish, so it's difficult to do red counts on because they don't make very big reds. So electrofishing mainly in Boulder Creek, but elsewhere we use red counts as kind of our primary tool.
So generally for those big migratory bull trout, you can go out in the fall and see where they've disturbed, when they're spawning, see where they've disturbed the gravel bed and count those as an estimate for the population. Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Well, I'm going to introduce now Bo Downing, who is from the NRDP Natural Resource Damage Program. And he is a restoration project manager. NRDP has a really unique role in getting this work done on the ground. And so, Bo, do you want to talk about that role and kind of what you guys do over there at NRDP for us?
Sure. So I'm Bo Downing with the Natural Resource Damage Program. I'm a restoration project manager that focus on a lot of the aquatic restoration work in tributaries and some other work in other places in the basin and outside of it. The work that we're talking about today and in the Upper Clark Fork in general is tied to money that was recovered for damages to our aquatic resources, tied to a lot of the contamination and impacts to the fisheries that occurred on the main stem of the Clark Fork. There are lots of complex pots of money between remediation on the main stem of the Clark Fork, restoration dollars for the main stem of the Clark Fork, but then other damages that occurred in the basin. And to make a long story short, there are monies allocated to the tributaries that try and replace some of those lost resources on the main stem of the Clark Fork. And the thinking behind that was there's a lot of work to be done on the main stem of the Clark Fork, but we don't want to keep losing temporarily all that fishing opportunities, fish populations, fish habitat. So we moved into the tributaries because they, one, weren't contaminated, or at least not as contaminated. There are other issues in some of these places, but not directly tied to what happened on the main stem of the Clark Fork. So you go to the tributaries where you have decent populations of fish, but could be made better through restoration activities. And so that's what we did on Boulder Creek here, was look at some of the limiting factors. We have a restoration plan that guides all of this. And allocates money to priority tributaries that Brad talked about a little while ago. So those monies are allocated to these priority tributaries for the goal of restoring fisheries there, replacing some of those lost fisheries opportunities, and ultimately with the goal of getting more fish to out-migrate to the Clark Fork River as things get cleaned up there. So there's a pot of money allocated to Flint Creek and Boulder Creek, and that's where these projects were funded and undertaken. There are other projects, really big projects going on in Flint Creek that will help provide that connectivity from not only the upper basin or the upper valley, the Peaburg Valley, but as Boulder Creek comes out and those fish make their way to Flint Creek. We're doing a lot of other work downstream that should help get fish up to Boulder Creek and back down to the Clark Fork River.
Awesome, thanks, Bo. That's really good information about the work of the tributaries in the upper Clark Fork, complementing that big river, that super fun restoration that's going on the main stem. And we do have some interest from our attendees on that and that piece where there's a main stem and a tributaries piece. So we'll bring that back up in a little bit, but I'd like to give Jeremy the mic and a chance to introduce himself. For our attendees out here, Jeremy Mickey is a construction project manager, supervisor for a local construction company that has worked on these types of river and tributary restoration projects for a long time. We have several students and faculty in the attendees. So Jeremy studied the Milltown Dam removal when he was in college at the University of Montana. And he has a really interesting perspective on what this type of restoration means to the watershed and means to the community as a resident of both of those things. So Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your experience with that shovel in the dirt part of these projects.
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, my name is Jeremy Mickey. I've been lucky enough to actually live on Boulder Creek and almost at the confluence of Boulder Creek and Flint Creek. My family has been in this area for, since the late 1880s. And I studied, as Lily mentioned, I studied the Clark Fork in the late 90s, working on Milltown Reservoir, and have worked and lived in the basin for most of my career. So I've been everything from a researcher to a consultant to oversight to now I'm working for a construction company. And it's just fun to be part of something that's making such a big difference in the local area. You know, on top of doing the restoration and remediation work that's helping everything out, you know, it also brings quite a few dollars to the local economy and provides good jobs for guys that are qualified to do this type of work locally. So it's pretty exciting business to be in, and I enjoy it a lot.
Awesome. So we can jump into some of these questions now. And panelists, I'd like to give you all a chance to kind of jump in and answer these. If you have something you want to say to some of these questions, just go ahead and grab the mic from us and take it away. But I was wondering if anybody wants to talk a little bit about the success of these restoration projects and how maybe we are or we're expecting to see them help the general health of the Clark Fork.
I can go first on that question. We were just out this summer looking at these projects again while this stuff was going on, and at the Olson Project, where we removed Boulder Creek from the pond and put it back in a historic channel with some channel regrading and a plug and things, had some of the most complex trout habitat in that general area. Lots of large wood, big boulders, a lot of channel complexity, a lot of things that provide not only micro habitat, but macro habitat on a larger scale. And it looks real fishy. I don't know what the sampling shows through there, but I'm sure Jeremy's fished it and found some good stuff, but really nice, complex fisheries habitat that we've been able to reconnect Boulder Creek to with absolutely no up or downstream migration issues. Maybe it's not full migration out to the Clark Fork, but we're no longer impeding fish from finding and utilizing really high quality habitats. You know, I guess ultimately the idea is projects like that will help boost fish populations, and when they start bumping into each other enough, they'll want to go find somewhere else, and that'll tie into other work that we're doing in the drainage. And then on the Lundgren property, there's a lot of really cool things, like in Will's before and after photo. We're having some channel narrowing, we're having some cool deposition in places, a lot of pool maintenance in other places. And just the nature of that site, when we were going to do the project, you have to get permits, and we had to delineate all the wetlands. Turns out that entire meadow is essentially a wetland. So we have all this really great groundwater that's coming from kind of that meadow, and you couldn't ask for better riparian plant growing situations than that. So it's going to be a forest of riparian plants in no time, and it's already well on its way. So, you know, just really good project success on both of these.
I think that brings up a good point, and something that certainly the panelists, I'm sure you've thought a lot about, the idea of success. And maybe, Brad, this is a good question for you. But in a project like this, success means different things to different parties who are involved in the project. And I wonder if you want to speak a little bit about that, about what the outcomes or the goals of this project are and how they might look different if you're a landowner versus a fisheries biologist.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, definitely being a fisheries biologist and working for an agency that focuses on angling and fisheries. We like to look at the ultimate result as fish numbers or you know, benefits to the fish population, but there are definitely a lot more perspectives than that. You know, as far as fish monitoring, we don't have a lot of data on either project right now. It's a little difficult actually to monitor the Olson project because it's really such a watershed wide effect. We not having fish passage in kind of the middle reaches of a drainage, as everybody can imagine, has a big effect on the whole drainage. So it's almost immeasurable kind of benefits you can have from that, because you are providing access for fish to spawn in the upper watershed where most of the spawning is occurring, to fish that are getting below that reach, which commonly occurs. So it's almost one of those projects you don't have to really have data, and it's not easy to get data on, but we know it's going to have a huge effect. The Lundgren Project, we just need to collect a little more data there to really see the effect, but I'm sure we're going to see it because the habitat really has improved. But yeah, as far as objectives, definitely, like I said, we focus on fish and fish habitat because that's our focus. But definitely landowners a lot of times have different perspectives on what they want to see. And I think the Olson Project's a great example where Ole said in his video, he wants quality fish habitat, but he also, I don't remember if he said it, but he also has a pond that he wants to maintain, which has been there for a lot of years. And it was an interesting dynamic because before the restoration was done, Ole was having to do a lot of work to actually keep his pond in place. And it wasn't always, some of the stuff wasn't stuff I necessarily wanted to see done on Boulder Creek because I wanted good fish passage through there. And so it was a situation that was a little bit difficult to try to keep everybody happy and provide the best thing for the fishery. But this project was great and it aligned all of our interests and kind of fixed all the problems that we had, and kind of was a win-win for everybody. And we're really lucky in the Upper Clark Fork to have NRDP and Bo and also the Clark Fork Coalition and partners like these folks, because they can pull projects like this together, where sometimes we do get stuck in positions where if we don't have money, we don't have cooperators to work with. Sometimes it's hard to get this stuff done. But there definitely are a lot of different objectives from different people involved in projects, and it's not easy to align all those, but definitely Will and Bo and Jeremy were able to kind of pull that off here, and hopefully we'll build out other places in the Upper Clark Fork too.
Awesome. Does anybody else have anything to add into that? What are we seeing as success of this project? Go ahead, Will.
Well, I'll just jump in and elaborate a little bit on that, the distinct perspectives between the landowners and the agencies and funders. The landowners and the Lundgren side, you know, they were interested primarily in looking for bank protection and avoiding Boulder Creek jumping out of its channel or avulsing into their meadow and cutting a new channel through the meadow. You know, a lot of landowners see that as, you know, a creek misbehaving. But the reality is the main reason that Boulder Creek would have a tendency to jump out of its banks and go through that meadow is because the meadow has had all the native forest and heavy cover that used to cover that land removed. So it makes it easier for the stream to actually find a new path. And that's exactly what happened on Olson's project as well. And so, you know, there's kind of like two different concerns that actually end up balancing each other if you can develop a good project, which I think we did in each of these cases. So they were concerned about that, and they wanted to put rock in the stream to keep the stream from eroding its banks any further, and they had started to do that type of project. But you know, the perspective that Bo brought and the perspective that Brad brings is, no, let's build habitat for fish. We're not here, these funds are not here to solve private landowners' problems. That's not at all what the funding is for. So we looked at the situation and had a good engineer from Pioneer Technical come up with some log structures, especially on the Lundgren Project, and used large logs that were provided by the landowner, lodgepole pine and Doug fir logs, and we wove those together into engineered log jams that are providing really excellent habitat. When those guys talk about complexity, a lot of times what they're talking about is log jams and cover for fish that they can get down inside and get away from predators. And so those structures are really working well to provide fish habitat. On the side, they're also slowing down the water and providing some hydraulic effects that are reducing the amount of potential bank erosion. So that's almost a side effect, but it's actually meeting some of the landowners' initial concerns with a technique that they had never seen.
Awesome, thanks, Will. It looks like Bo doesn't want to answer that question. He's out of here.
Classic Zoom, my kids were acting up.
No.
What was the question? Can you repeat it for me, Will?
Oh, no, I was just teasing you. But we have had some questions come in about extending restoration to the main stem Clark Fork itself. And yes, all of these partners are also involved in the main stem Superfund restoration, as well as these efforts to restore tributaries. I think it's really interesting, and Jeremy, I might ask you to jump on and just talk a little bit about the extent of the restoration work that you're involved in the Upper Clark Fork for the past, you know, however long, decade, 5 years, however far you want to go back.
It's a couple of decades now, but yeah, I've seen been working on the Upper Clark Fork on the Clark Fork Coalition Ranch. I did a lot of the sampling and modeling that was done out there to come up with the design that was then turned into a construction project for what they called phases 5 and 6. That turned out to be also a very successful project, I think, in that it had combined remediation and restoration. So we removed almost 500,000 yards of tailings from the riparian area down there, and put them in the repository by opportunity. That was about a 2.5 year job to get that done and get that restored. And then working downstream from there, I've worked in the town of Deer Lodge itself, cleaning up residential yards, from sampling to design, and then going through the oversight and construction and maintenance, and working our way towards some projects on Flint Creek, just below the confluence. We've just been awarded a project on the Allendale Canal, where we're going to put in a large fish screen in a canal, irrigation canal that takes, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost half of the water out of Flint Creek for irrigation, and then you know, build a large fish screen there, and then 3 smaller fish screens on some private irrigators ditch, and that's going to all take place this winter. And I'm super excited to take my fly rod out and see how that impacts the fishery.
So you can confirm that there are some fish hiding out in these log structures on Boulder Creek. Is that true, Jeremy?
I can confirm that when we restored Boulder Creek to its original channel through the Olson property, that there are fish now residing in the original channel.
Awesome. Scientific angler.
Yep, and they're still there. They got a kiss and returned back to where they were. But yeah, it's turned into a really nice spot back there now.
Awesome. One of the questions that has come in a couple times is just about the effects of mining in these drainages. We talked about two projects that were more tied to land use, so maybe overgrazing impacting a stream's ability to hold cool, cold fish habitat, massive flooding, reconfiguring a channel. But how does the mining piece and the effects of that play into this watershed in Flint Creek, in Boulder Creek, and Flint Creek, and beyond?
Well, in Boulder Creek, I can speak. I seen the question come up about tailings impacts, and there was I'd say it's about probably 4 miles above where the Olson Project took place. There was a mine and mill up there called the Brooklyn Mill, and that was cleaned up by the Forest Service in must have been the early 90s, but I was going to say like 95, something like that. And that was about the same time that I was at U of M working in the lab. And so I was doing real scientific monitoring at the time. And just from the dissolved element concentrations that I saw before that cleanup and then after that cleanup take place, Flint Creek is in a really good position. And then when you go farther upstream from there, there really isn't any major mining or mine relics on the main stem of Flint Creek. There's some up in some of the tributaries to that, but I think overall Boulder Creek is, I think, in really, really good shape. The downstream of the Clark Fork, we see the relics of that big 1908 flood and the tailings deposition across the floodplain, clear down to the Drummond area, and it's going to be a long time coming before that can be restored.
Do we have anybody else who kind of wants to weigh in on some of the mining legacy in the Flint Creek area especially, and how that is being remediated? And maybe a good place to move after that is just future steps, because certainly the two projects that we saw in Boulder Creek are not the end of the story for the work that we all are going to be doing there. So if you want to move into that question, go ahead.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about mining impacts? So you want to go, Bill? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say we've woven a pretty tangled web on what we've discussed as it relates to mining impacts and tailings. And I think it's important to take a step back, and the money that my program, the Natural Resource Damage Program, is investing in these tributaries is to restore fisheries and not to remediate some of these mining impacts in these priority tributaries. A lot of those are abandoned mine lands or places where they haven't identified someone like ARCO that we have on the main stem of the Clark Fork River. So a lot of that is taken on by a program at DEQ, the Abandoned Mine Lands Group. So there's mercury issues in Flint Creek that my program would never touch. There were the mines that Jeremy was just talking about in Boulder Creek that we would never touch with our particular pots of money. So all the investment that NRDP is making in these priority tributaries is a result of impacts on the main stem of the Clark Fork River that have been allocated to fisheries restoration in these tributaries, and that's where this Boulder Creek money came from. So there are other groups that take on some of these other mining impacts in watersheds, and then there's major super fund that occurs on the main stem of the Clark Fork River. So there's all these different pots of money, all these different settlements, all these legal documents that dictate how those monies can be spent. So the Upper Clark Fork is just a mishmash of money and programs and varying goals and responsibilities. So there's a lot of information on the web about how all that kind of plays together. But I just wanted to point out how complex this really is from a remedial and a restoration standpoint in the entire Upper Clark Fork Basin, from the old Milltown dam site up.
Awesome. And Brad, did you want to weigh in on those mining impacts at all?
Yeah, I could talk real quick. I know we only have so much time, but one of the and Bo already talked a little bit about, but one of the main impacts that we're seeing from mining in the Flint Creek drainage. Obviously, the Flint Creek drainage has been heavily mined kind of throughout. Definitely, certain tributaries have had a lot of mining activity in the past. But one of the main impacts hasn't been mitigated, because some of these have been fixed, but one of the main impacts is mercury inputs into Flint Creek. And the main source of that is Fred Burr Creek, and there's a lot of work and effort going into trying to look at that. Also, South Fork Lower Willow Creek is also another site that's had really high mercury levels. It still does, although that's been remediated, a lot of it. So we're monitoring that to see how that improves. But mercury is definitely one of the biggest issues in the drainage, and is even having downstream effects on the Clark Fork, which has been shown in wildlife impacts, and then also some human health issues with just consumption of fish. So that's one of the big things in the Flint Creek drainage.
And that is an interesting thing to a lot of people, is the mercury issue in Flint Creek, because if you are in Missoula, believe it or not, it's having an impact fairly close to us. People are often looking for more information on that. If you are interested in that, you can visit our Clark Fork Coalition Facebook page, and we have an interview video on up there with Eric Green from the Bird Ecology Lab, who works with the osprey populations in the area and has studied the Flint Creek mercury for a long time. So panelists and attendees, we are coming up to the end of our time together. If you have any last questions, you can enter them in the chat. If we don't get them answered in our short time, we can always get in touch with you and send you those answers again. At the end of our time, I will throw up a slide that will give you a link to that video that you watched on Boulder Creek today, as well as contact information for all of our panelists if you want to contact them directly with questions about the projects. But right now, I would like to give everyone a chance to kind of give their last closing words about the project and about the field trip. So maybe we'll start with you, and then move on to Jeremy, Bo, and Brad to give your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would just like to say thanks to everyone for attending. We had very ambitious plans at the beginning of this year to do field trips and take people out to see these sites, because as Bo said, these two projects are doing extremely well. They've been they were implemented almost 3 years ago. So they're really turning out nicely in terms of vegetative recovery and performing as planned. Just wanted to highlight again the Watershed Restoration Coalition's role in this is really primary in terms of the outreach work, and that's a great organization based out of Deer Lodge. That's a lot of work with NRDP and other partners. So those are just a couple things I wanted to comment on. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Will. Jeremy, any closing thoughts?
I just want to say thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. It's always nice to be on the successful end of a project and to see the outcome come as far as it has, and be a part of a good series of projects. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy, for joining us. Bo, do you have any closing thoughts about the project or the field trip?
Yeah, just thanks for everybody that came, and it's fun to highlight some of the projects that don't involve killing fish, like on the main stem of the Clark Fork. So it's always good to go talk about some of the really big successes we've had to support the fishery of the basin.
Awesome. Brad?
Yeah, just one thing real quick. I was going to kind of answer a question that somebody brought up too about the main stem of the Clark Fork and how this stuff interacts. We definitely are looking at that, just so folks know. We know that, obviously people like to break a watershed out like Boulder Creek and look at it individually, but as agencies, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, NRDP, Clark Fork Coalition, we're looking at the impacts of this type of work has on Flint Creek and the main stem of Clark Fork, and overall, what the remediation of the Clark Fork and all this restoration NRDP is doing, what impact that's going to have in the end. And hopefully 30 years from now, we're going to see a big watershed-wide impact, and that's a positive impact. So whoever asked that question, I just wanted to make that clear that we are looking at all that connectivity and the effects of all this kind of on the big picture. And other than that, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're
I'm
muted.
gonna throw up now for everybody who's an attendee, just the contact information for these folks who joined us today, as well as a place where you can revisit that Boulder Creek Watershed Restoration video. Panelists, you're free to turn off your cameras if you don't mind sticking around for just a few minutes as people log off, so we can wrap up on our own. But thank you everybody for joining us today to visit Boulder Creek. If you have more questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. You can learn more about the Clark Fork Coalition at clarkfork.org, as well as visit all of these project partners at their websites or with their emails that are included here. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your day.